She never made a sound for 3 months of marriage, communicating only through gentle gestures and written notes that made Thomas believe he had found the perfect, silent companion through the mail-order bride catalogue. But at 2:15 on that October morning, when the nightmare struck and her voice shattered the darkness, the name that tore from her throat wasn't his, it was Marcus. And suddenly, everything Thomas thought he knew about his beautiful, supposedly deaf and mute wife crumbled into a lie that would destroy them both. The morning light cut through the kitchen windows like accusations, casting jagged shadows across Sarah's trembling face as Thomas stood in the doorway, his coffee cup forgotten in white-knuckled hands. She sat at their worn wooden table, her dark hair catching the autumn sun, but her eyes held a terror that had nothing to do with his unexpected presence and everything to do with what she thought he might know. Thomas cleared his throat deliberately, watching, waiting. Her head snapped toward the sound before she caught herself, her hands flying up in the practiced gestures of the deaf. But it was too late. He had seen the truth in that involuntary response. 3 months of marriage. 3 months of believing he had found sanctuary in silence with this beautiful woman who communicated through gentle touches and handwritten notes that spoke of gratitude and growing affection. 3 months of thinking he could love without the messy complications of spoken words, without the painful intimacy of shared secrets. But Marcus. That name had shattered more than the night's quiet when it tore from her sleeping lips like a confession ripped from unwilling flesh. Thomas stepped closer, his boots heavy on the planked floor, and Sarah's eyes tracked every movement with the precision of someone who heard every creak, every breath, every heartbeat of approach. Her hands moved frantically now, spelling out denials in the sign language they had learned together. But her performance held the desperation of a lie, crumbling under scrutiny. The morning sun revealed everything she had tried to hide, from the way her body tensed at sounds she supposedly could not hear to the careful calculation behind her supposedly spontaneous responses. Thomas spoke her name softly, then louder, watching her fight the instinct to respond, watching her lose that fight as her shoulders sagged with the weight of maintaining an impossible deception. She began to cry then, silent tears that spoke louder than any scream, and Thomas felt his own heart breaking not just for the betrayal but for the terror in her eyes that suggested her silence was not choice but survival. The kitchen that had been their peaceful morning sanctuary became a courtroom where truth hung in the air like dust motes caught in unforgiving light. Thomas set down his coffee cup with deliberate care, the ceramic clicking against wood like a gavel, and sat across from his wife, who was not the woman he married, whose very identity was a masterpiece of necessity and fear. Her hands stilled on the table between them, and in that moment of suspended motion, Thomas understood that whatever had driven Sarah to this elaborate masquerade was bigger than loneliness, more dangerous than simple deception, and that the name Marcus carried with it a threat that made his quiet farmer's life suddenly feel as fragile as morning frost. And now's the time to stop and subscribe to our channel. Every subscriber brings us closer to 1,000, which helps us keep these stories alive and coming your way. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far these tales travel across the world. Now let's continue. 2 years before Sarah's tears fell on their kitchen table, Thomas had buried his heart in the frozen Kansas earth alongside his first wife, Margaret, whose final screams during 3 days of failed labor had taught him that love was nothing more than an invitation to unbearable loss. The memory crashed over him now like winter wind across his failing wheat fields, those golden stalks that once promised prosperity now bent and broken like his faith in tomorrow. Margaret had been everything Sarah was not: talkative, curious, constantly filling their small farmhouse with questions about his thoughts, his dreams, his fears that he could never quite voice without feeling like he was handing her weapons to wound him. She would lie beside him in their bed, her hand tracing circles on his chest as she spoke of the children they would raise and the life they would build together, her voice weaving a future that seemed too beautiful to survive contact with reality. When the birthing pains began that October morning 2 autumns past, Margaret had gripped his hand with desperate strength and begged him to tell her everything would be fine, to promise her their baby would live to see Christmas morning, to swear that love could conquer the blood and agony that filled their bedroom like a verdict. Thomas had whispered those lies through 3 days and nights, watching helplessness drain the light from her eyes as their child fought a losing battle to enter a world that seemed determined to reject new life. The midwife from town had shaken her head on the final morning, gathering her bloodied instruments with the practiced resignation of someone who had witnessed too many such defeats, and Thomas had found himself alone with silence that felt like blessing after Margaret's final rattling breath. The wheat harvest failed that year, and the next, and Thomas had convinced himself that his isolation was practical rather than protective, that ordering a bride who could not speak was efficiency rather than cowardice. Henderson's matrimonial agency had seemed like providence when Thomas specified his unusual requirements. A woman who would share his home and his name, but never ask him to bare his soul through midnight conversations about hope and loss, and the terrible vulnerability of caring more for another person than for his own survival. He had imagined Sarah as a beautiful ghost who would move through his house like morning mist, present but insubstantial, warming his bed without demanding access to the chambers of his heart, where Margaret's voice still echoed with questions he had never learned to answer. The $2,000 he had paid Henderson represented every cent of his remaining savings, money that should have gone towards seed for spring planting or repairs to his sagging barn roof. But Thomas had reasoned that a wife who could not speak could never ask for more than he was willing to give. The dusty streets of Kansas City felt like foreign territory as Thomas hitched his wagon outside Henderson's matrimonial agency, the building's peeling paint and grimy windows reflecting the moral decay he was beginning to suspect festered within its walls. Henderson himself emerged from behind towers of bride photographs like a rat from grain stores, his oiled hair catching the afternoon light as he wiped sweaty palms on a vest that had seen better decades and cleaner meals. The office reeked of desperation and cheap cologne, its walls lined with hundreds of faces promising companionship to lonely men who could afford the illusion of choice in matters of the heart. Thomas had never noticed before how Henderson's eyes never quite met his own, how the man's smile carried the practiced insincerity of someone who sold dreams to the desperate and counted profit, while others counted heartbeats. When Thomas mentioned Sarah's name, Henderson's face shifted almost imperceptibly, a flicker of recognition followed by the calculated blankness of a man preparing to lie. The agency owner shuffled papers with theatrical confusion, claiming no specific memory of Thomas's wife among the dozens of arrangements he facilitated monthly, but his hands trembled as he spoke, and sweat beaded on his upper lip, despite the autumn chill that seeped through the building's thin walls. Thomas pressed harder, describing Sarah's distinctive dark hair and delicate features, watching Henderson's performance crumble like old newspaper as the man's nervous laughter filled the cramped space between stacks of photographs that suddenly seemed less like hope and more like inventory in a human marketplace. The breakthrough came when Thomas mentioned the unusual request for a deaf and mute bride, and Henderson's face went pale as milk left too long in summer heat. Under Thomas's steady gaze, the truth spilled out like water from a broken dam. Sarah had approached the agency herself, paying double the standard fee to be listed with disabilities she did not possess, specifically requesting placement with a man who lived far from cities and crowds. Henderson's confession revealed Sarah as architect rather than victim of their unusual arrangement, a woman who had calculated that a remote farm and a husband seeking silence would provide the perfect hiding place from whatever demons pursued her through the corridors of her past. The office that had once seemed like a respectable business now revealed itself as a bazaar where broken people bartered pieces of themselves for temporary safety, where loneliness was currency and deception was simply another service offered for the right price. as Thomas left Henderson cowering behind his desk of dreams and lies. The weight of Sarah's elaborate masquerade settled on his shoulders like a yoke he had never agreed to carry, and he understood that his quiet farm had become a sanctuary, not just for his wounded heart, but for secrets that might prove more dangerous than the silence he had thought he wanted. That evening Thomas lay rigid beside his wife in their moonlit bedroom, forcing his breathing into the steady rhythm of sleep, while every muscle in his body coiled with the tension of deception meeting deception in the intimate darkness they had shared for 3 months of lies. The silver light, streaming through their cotton curtains, transformed Sarah's sleeping face into something ethereal and foreign, as if the woman he had married existed only in daylight hours, while this stranger emerged to confess her sins to the prairie night. Her first murmurs came softly, wordless sounds that could have been dismissed as the natural sighs of slumber, but Thomas had learned to listen for truth in the spaces between her careful performances, and he heard the weight of actual language forming behind her closed lips. When Marcus's name first escaped her throat, it carried with it a longing so desperate and raw that Thomas felt his own heart clench with unwilling sympathy for a love that had driven his wife to construct an entire false identity rather than face its consequences. Her sleeping voice grew stronger as the dreams took hold, and Thomas listened with growing horror as Sarah pleaded with the darkness for forgiveness, her unconscious confessions revealing a story of passion and betrayal that made their marriage bed feel like a confessional booth where he served as unwilling priest to secrets he had never wanted to hear. The words tumbled from her lips in perfect, educated English that bore no trace of the rural simplicity she performed during waking hours, speaking of debts and threats and promises broken in ways that suggested Marcus was not merely a lost love, but a dangerous enemy whose reach had driven her to seek refuge in the arms of a stranger who desired nothing more than blessed silence. Thomas realized with growing dread that his farm had become a hiding place for crimes he could not yet fathom, that his desire for a wife who could not speak had made him accomplice to deceptions that reached far beyond their modest homestead, into a world of violence and retribution that threatened to shatter the fragile peace he had tried to build from the wreckage of his first marriage. Sarah's sleeping form twisted beside him as her nightmares intensified, and Thomas heard her beg Marcus for mercy, promising to return money she had taken, swearing she had never meant to hurt anyone, her unconscious mind revealing the truth that her waking performance had so carefully concealed. The bedroom that had been their sanctuary became a theatre where Sarah's true story played out in fragments and gasps, each revelation driving home the terrible understanding that Thomas had not rescued a woman seeking simple companionship, but had instead harbored a fugitive whose past was racing toward their door like a storm that would destroy everything in its path, including the quiet love that had grown between them despite the foundation of mutual deception upon which it had been built. The sound of approaching hooves shattered the morning quiet, like gunshots across Thomas's failing wheat fields, and through their kitchen window he watched a man emerge from a black carriage with the predatory grace of someone accustomed to taking what he wanted without asking permission. Marcus was everything Thomas was not, immaculately dressed in a tailored suit that spoke of city wealth, his dark hair pomaded to perfection, his bearing radiating the kind of confidence that came from never having to work soil with bleeding hands or pray for rain that might never come. Sarah froze at the wash basin where she had been cleaning their breakfast dishes, her face draining of color as she recognized the voice calling her name across their front yard with the casual authority of ownership, and Thomas watched her careful deaf-mute facade crumble in real time as terror overrode 3 months of practiced deception. The stranger's words cut through the autumn air like a blade through silk, demanding to see the woman who had stolen $2,000 from him before vanishing like morning mist, and Thomas felt his world tilt sideways as the sum mentioned matched exactly what he had paid Henderson's matrimonial agency for his supposedly innocent bride. From his position by the window, Thomas could see Sarah's body language confessing everything Marcus accused her of. The way she pressed herself against the kitchen wall as if solid wood could protect her from the reckoning that had finally found their remote sanctuary, the way her hands shook as she heard every syllable of Marcus's threats despite her performance of deafness, the way her eyes tracked the stranger's movements with the desperate calculation of prey measuring the distance to safety. Marcus's voice carried the smooth menace of a man who had never needed to raise his tone to convey violence, speaking of debts that demanded payment and promises that could not be broken without consequences that would extend far beyond Sarah's personal safety into the lives of anyone foolish enough to harbor her. Thomas watched his wife's reflection in their kitchen window overlay the image of her accuser, two figures blending into a tableau of guilt and retribution that transformed his modest farmhouse into a stage for reckonings he had never invited but could no longer avoid. The confrontation in their front yard stripped away the last vestiges of the peaceful isolation Thomas had cultivated since Margaret's death, revealing that his attempt to control love through limitation had instead made him accomplice to crimes that threatened to destroy not just his marriage but his very life. As Marcus's patience visibly thinned and his demands grew more explicit, Thomas understood that the $2,000 he had paid for Sarah's companionship had never been Henderson's fee but stolen money that Sarah had used to purchase her freedom, making their entire marriage a transaction built on theft and desperation rather than the simple loneliness he had thought they shared. The match flared to life in Marcus's manicured fingers like a tiny star of destruction, its sulphur flame dancing with malicious promise as he held it inches from the oil-soaked rag he had wrapped around a stick torn from Thomas's own fence. And in that suspended moment between threat and action, Sarah's 3 months of carefully constructed silence shattered like glass against stone. Thomas. Her voice tore across the farmyard with the desperate power of someone choosing love over survival, her scream carrying not just warning but the terrible weight of a woman sacrificing everything she had built to protect the man who had unknowingly harbored her secrets and her growing, impossible love. The sound hit Thomas like a physical blow as he crouched behind their kitchen window, watching his wife abandon the deception that had kept her alive for the authentic terror of someone who could not bear to watch an innocent man burn for her sins. And he understood in that crystalline instant that whatever Sarah had done, whatever she had stolen, her feelings for him had transcended the calculated desperation that had brought her to his farm. Marcus's laughter rang across the yard with the cold satisfaction of a hunter who had finally forced his prey into the open, the burning match casting shadows that danced like demons across his face as he realized that Sarah's broken silence had confirmed not just her guilt but her weakness, the fatal flaw that would allow him to reclaim what she had taken and exact the punishment her months of hiding had only delayed. Sarah burst from the farmhouse like a woman possessed, her careful facade of disability abandoned as she ran toward Marcus with her hands raised in surrender, her voice now flowing in desperate English as she begged him to spare Thomas and take his vengeance on her alone, her words tumbling over each other in their urgency, to convince her tormentor that an innocent farmer should not pay for crimes he had never committed. The revelation of her voice transformed the confrontation from cat and mouse to something far more complex and tragic, as Thomas realized that Sarah's love for him was not performance but the one authentic element in their relationship built on mutual deception, and that her choice to speak would likely cost her everything she had sacrificed so much to protect. Marcus let the match burn down nearly to his fingers before blowing it out with theatrical cruelty, his eyes never leaving Sarah's face as he savored her desperation and the knowledge that her feelings for Thomas had given him the ultimate weapon to ensure her compliance with whatever demands he had traveled so far to make. In breaking her silence to save Thomas, Sarah had revealed not just her ability to hear and speak, but the depth of her transformation from calculating fugitive to woman genuinely willing to die for love, and Thomas felt his own heart breaking for the choice she had made and the terrible consequences it would surely bring to them both. Marcus swept into their modest parlor, like a judge entering his courtroom, his expensive suit a stark contrast to the simple furnishings that Thomas and Sarah had arranged with such hopeful care during the early days of their marriage, and his voice carried the casual cruelty of a man revealing truths designed to destroy rather than illuminate, as he began to unravel the story that had driven Sarah into Thomas's unsuspecting arms. She had been his mistress for 2 years, Marcus explained with the detached precision of someone recounting a business transaction, living in the elegant apartment he had provided on the fashionable side of Chicago, while his wife and 3 children remained blissfully ignorant of his double life in their mansion overlooking Lake Michigan. Sarah's tears fell like rain on their worn carpet as Marcus described how she had discovered his deception through a letter left carelessly in his coat pocket, how her threats to expose his adultery to his socially prominent wife had transformed her from cherished secret to dangerous liability in the space of a single afternoon. The theft charge had been elegantly simple. Marcus continued with obvious pride in his own cunning. A ruby necklace planted in Sarah's apartment, reliable witnesses purchased with generous bribes, and a warrant signed by a judge who owed Marcus considerable favors from years of political maneuvering that had made them both wealthy men. Thomas watched his wife's face crumble as the truth emerged. Understanding now why she had chosen deafness and muteness as her disguise, not from greed but from the desperate knowledge that her voice itself had become a weapon that powerful men could use to destroy her, if she ever dared speak her dangerous truths again. The parlor that had witnessed their quiet courtship and gentle growing affection became an arena where the past and present collided with devastating force, Marcus's revelations stripping away every assumption Thomas had made about Sarah's character, while simultaneously revealing the terrible courage it had taken for her to trust him enough to build even a false life in his arms. Sarah's confession came in broken whispers that confirmed every word of Marcus's account, her voice hoarse from months of deliberate silence, as she admitted to Thomas that she had indeed taken the $2,000 from Marcus's safe before fleeing Chicago, not as theft but as partial payment for 2 years of lies that had stolen her reputation, her freedom, and her faith in love itself. Marcus's smile grew wider as he watched the devastation his revelations caused, savoring the destruction of the fragile sanctuary Sarah had built on Thomas's isolated farm, and the growing understanding in Thomas's eyes that his marriage was not just built on deception, but on crimes that could send his wife to prison or worse if Marcus chose to pursue the justice that money and influence could so easily purchase. In that moment of terrible clarity, Thomas realized that Sarah's choice of a deaf-mute marriage had been not calculation but survival, the desperate gamble of a woman who had learned that speaking truth to power only brought more sophisticated forms of silencing, and that her growing love for him represented the first honest emotion she had dared feel since discovering that the man she had trusted with her heart had been using her body to betray another woman's trust. The silence that followed Marcus's revelations pressed against the walls of their modest parlor like a living thing, and Thomas felt the weight of choice settling on his shoulders with the terrible finality of a man standing at the edge of a cliff who must decide whether to jump or turn back to the safety of solid ground. Marcus watched him with the patient satisfaction of a predator who had cornered his prey and now waited for the inevitable surrender, his manicured fingers drumming against the arm of Thomas's threadbare chair, as he calculated how long it would take a simple farmer to choose self-preservation over a woman who had built their entire marriage on lies. Sarah stood frozen between the 2 men who held her fate in their hands, her face a map of desperation and resignation as she waited for Thomas to make the rational choice that would save his farm and his future by delivering her back to the justice that Marcus's money and influence could so easily to arrange. But as Thomas looked at his wife, he saw not the calculating deceiver that Marcus's story had revealed, but the woman who had screamed his name to save his life, who had abandoned 3 months of life-preserving silence because she could not bear to watch him burn for sins he had never committed, who had wept genuine tears when she thought her past might destroy the quiet happiness they had built together, despite its foundation of mutual deception. The words that came from Thomas's mouth surprised even him with their quiet strength. His voice steady as prairie wind as he told Marcus that Sarah's debt had become his responsibility the moment she took his name, and that he would work every day of his remaining life to repay the $2,000 through honest labor if that was what justice required. Marcus's laughter filled their parlor like the sound of breaking glass, his disbelief evident as he stared at the poor farmer who would choose financial ruin over the simple expedient of abandoning a wife who had never been honest about who she truly was. But Thomas felt something shift inside his chest, like ice breaking up in spring rivers, as he committed himself to protecting love despite its complications and costs. The transformation was immediate and profound, as if the man who had hidden from emotional connection since Margaret's death had finally found something worth the risk of devastating loss. And Thomas understood that his choice to stand with Sarah represented not just moral courage, but the end of his long retreat from the messy, dangerous, essential business of loving another person with full knowledge of the pain that love could bring. Sarah's sob of gratitude and disbelief filled the space between acceptance and terror as she realized that Thomas was willing to sacrifice his financial security and perhaps his life for a marriage that had begun as elaborate mutual deception, but had somehow bloomed into something authentic and worth defending against all the forces that threatened to tear it apart. Marcus's laughter died in his throat as he drew the pearl-handled revolver from his coat, with the fluid grace of a man who had settled many debts through violence, the weapon catching the afternoon light, streaming through their parlor windows like a promise of final judgment that would end all negotiations with the brutal simplicity of gunpowder and lead. The sight of the gun transformed their modest farmhouse into something from Thomas's worst nightmares, where the peaceful isolation he had cultivated since Margaret's death crumbled before the reality that some conflicts could not be avoided through silence and distance, that love itself had made him a target for the kind of sophisticated cruelty that thrived in places where money purchased immunity from consequences. But before Thomas could move or speak or even fully comprehend the mortal danger that Marcus's impatience had introduced into their home, Sarah stepped between the two men with the quiet dignity of someone who had always known this moment would come, her voice steady as mountain stone as she offered to return to Chicago immediately if Marcus would spare the life of the innocent man who had unknowingly harbored her for 3 months of borrowed happiness. Thomas felt his heart break and rebuild itself in the space of that single gesture, understanding finally that Sarah's greatest deception had never been her false disabilities or her stolen identity, but her stubborn, self-destructive attempt to carry the weight of her past alone, rather than trust him with the dangerous truth that loving her might cost him everything he had worked to preserve. In that crystalline moment of suspended violence, Thomas saw their entire relationship with new eyes. Sarah's careful distance that he had attributed to her supposed deafness, her reluctance to accept his growing affection, her tears when he spoke of permanence and future plans, all revealed now as the desperate caution of a woman trying to protect him from the consequences of her presence in his life. The gun in Marcus's hand represented more than immediate physical threat. It embodied the sophisticated violence that had driven Sarah to seek sanctuary in marriage to a stranger, the kind of power that could destroy lives with legal documents and purchase testimony, that could make truth itself irrelevant when money and influence aligned against the powerless and naive. Sarah's offer to sacrifice herself for Thomas's safety completed the transformation of their relationship from mutual deception to authentic love, both of them now willing to die rather than watch the other suffer, both finally understanding that the elaborate lies that had brought them together had somehow created space for the most honest emotion either had ever experienced. Thomas looked at his wife standing brave and doomed between him and Marcus's gun, and realized that their marriage had become exactly what he had tried to avoid, a connection so deep and true that losing it would be worse than death, a love that demanded he risk everything rather than accept the safety that came from standing aside while evil consumed what he had learned to cherish above his own survival. The hunting rifle felt heavy as salvation in Thomas's hands as he emerged from their bedroom where it had hung unused since the deer season that followed Margaret's death, its worn wooden stock familiar against his shoulder as he levelled the barrel at Marcus's chest and spoke words that surprised him with their unwavering conviction about ownership and protection, and the simple truth that Sarah belonged to this farm now, to this life they had built together despite its foundation of necessary lies. Marcus's pearl-handled revolver suddenly seemed less impressive when faced with the business end of a weapon designed to drop charging elk at 100 yards, wielded by a man whose steady hands had fed his family through countless harsh winters, and whose eyes held the calm certainty of someone who had finally found something worth killing to protect. The standoff stretched between them like a taut wire, Marcus's city-bred confidence wavering as he realized he faced not one desperate woman alone but two people who had discovered something worth dying for, their shared willingness to sacrifice everything, transforming them from individual victims into a united force that his money and influence could not simply purchase or intimidate into submission. Thomas watched understanding dawn in Marcus's eyes as the well-dressed predator calculated odds that had shifted dramatically against him, recognizing that his threats had backfired by forcing Thomas and Sarah to choose each other over safety, creating the very bond that Marcus had hoped to exploit but that now stood as an impenetrable barrier against his revenge. The retreat came slowly, Marcus backing toward the door while keeping his gun trained on Thomas, his threats of future retribution falling like empty promises in the face of Thomas's steady rifle, and the quiet determination that radiated from both husband and wife as they stood together against the darkness that had pursued Sarah across half the country. When Marcus's carriage finally disappeared down the dusty road that led away from their farm, Thomas set aside his rifle and gathered Sarah into his arms with trembling hands that spoke of terror survived, and love declared through actions more powerful than any words they had ever shared during their months of careful deception. Sarah's voice came soft and honest against his shoulder as she spoke her real name for the first time, told him about the dreams she had harbored, before Marcus's betrayal taught her that love could be weapon as easily as sanctuary, confessed her growing affection for the gentle farmer who had asked so little of her that she had been able to give him everything without realizing she was surrendering her heart along with her secrets. Thomas held his wife and felt the last barriers between them crumble like autumn leaves, understanding that real love was not the safe, controlled emotion he had tried to purchase through Henderson's agency, but this dangerous, complicated, essential connection that required accepting another person's complete truth, including the darkness that had driven them into each other's arms, and the light that their courage had kindled from the ashes of mutual deception.